Hi Seba, thank you for doing this podcast. Maybe we can start with a quick intro about your background and what you're doing here in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I'm happy to be here. So I'm Sebastiano. I came here 8 years ago to study. I'm a management engineer. I studied in Milano at Politecnico first and then at Stanford University. And since then, I've been a product manager. I've been a little bit, I tried all flavors of product management. I started at NVIDIA with a more hardware, a systems product. Then I moved to a startup. I did blockchain, gaming, marketplaces, a very cool mix, which got me exposed to a lot of different types of problems and challenges. And now I work at Lyft, so again, bigger company, real-time marketplace for ride share for people that don't know what Lyft does.
And like you mentioned, of course, like product management. Can you maybe explain a little bit what product management actually like? What's like the day to day, and what are the different career paths to arrive here?
It's a great question because product management means a lot of different things in a lot of different companies. So when you look at a product management job, you don't know what to expect. It could be anything. I'm more of a technical product manager, meaning I face a lot of engineers. I write a lot of product specs. I contribute to tech specs with usually software architects, and I work very closely with engineering teams to then deliver those products. I think of product management in terms of a line, right? One side, extremely technical product manager is more like a software architect. So really building block diagrams, specifying interfaces between different software, microservices, in case you're dealing with that kind of architecture. So really speccing deeply and technically what you want a specific product to do and how it's built. On the opposite side is more the product marketing manager, so PMM, and that is someone who really takes care of usually a product that's already built or in the process of being built, defines the more customer-facing value propositions and takes care in messaging it, going out and maybe writing documentation and documents that are then used externally to advocate for the product and to try to usually sell the product. What you would find in the middle is maybe kind of a more traditional customer-facing UI UX product manager. So somebody who in a software product designs the interfaces and the interactions of the users and then passes it on to the engineers to kind of build the front end and the back end for it. Or in a more B2B, maybe architects how essentially the end users will interface with the product itself.
And what are like the different career paths to actually like become a product manager? Many mentors at the Silicon Valley Fellowship that now are product managers. Maybe they started as the software engineers, like data scientists, marketing people. What are like typical paths?
Yeah, it's also very common if you look at the product management descriptions, they always ask for some experience either in product management already or in some other field or discipline. I had the luck to actually start off after university in kind of a product management role, but really it was more of a program management role. So I think there's three main paths to become a product manager. First one is coming more from like program management, project management. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. And the second one is from a software engineer. And the third one is more from a data analyst, data scientist, consulting role. I'm going to talk about the three different paths. So the first one is a project manager. Usually, you can start out of your university as a project manager. You don't need a lot of context, but the good thing as a project manager, you're kind of thrown in the mix of everything that's happening. And the key skills to succeed there is a lot of organization and a lot of proactiveness, a lot of being able to talk to your stakeholders and really listen and understand what's happening. And the project manager effectively kind of takes a tab on what's happening, collects the due dates, the deadlines that each different team has, and then keeps track of that. The good thing is you get a lot of exposure, so you really understand how a company works, especially a big company, and all the different parts that are putting into creating a product. Sometimes as an engineer, you kind of build the code, and maybe in a big company you hand it off to like QA or then our SRE, which then deploys the code, and from there on you really don't know what's happening after. As a project manager, you get the exposure to all of that, which ultimately leads you to become a good product manager because you can think of a product in a holistic way because you know all the steps in it. The second one is a software engineer. So again, especially when you have bad product managers, software engineers sometimes get resentful because they're like, hey, or even hardware engineers like, hey, I know what I'm doing and you're asking me to do something which is not the best way. So then the software engineers won't become product managers. They understand how the soup is made, and so they can more effectively actually spec out what the product should be and be also mindful of what's reasonable versus what isn't. And finally, the more analyst, data science, or even from consulting roles, in some case marketing. The thing here is a lot of these roles often look at a lot of data. So they're like an analyst is always looking at data week by week, day by day. And so they kind of get a lot of knowledge of what works, what doesn't work. Product managers are supposed to be looking at a lot of data, but in the day-to-day, it happens that often you cannot spend the whole day like looking at data, digging through it, slicing it. So that third path is usually when the analyst, data science, or consultants are like, hey, I actually know what's happening here. I think I know what's needed, so I'm going to try to become a product manager so I can actually outline that definition.
And what do you think is actually needed, like a product manager as a role, especially like if you're a founder, like many people in the audience, maybe they are building their own startup, maybe they're aspiring to build their own startup. When do you think is the right moment to actually hire a product manager?
Yeah, that's also a very good question, because when you start a company, ultimately the founder is the product manager, right? So the CEO has to be defining what, not just the vision, the long-term vision, but also the short-term, very practical vision of what you're building, and making sure you're not building too much, making sure you don't scope creep. I would say product managers are start becoming helpful once you have different smaller teams which are building different things but have to work together. Because as long as you have one team, few people, like 5, 6, even 10 people in a single room,
you can coordinate.
You can kind of talk to each other. You don't really need someone to write a doc, explain it, and put everybody on the same page. When you start getting different pods, so different groups of usually 3 to 4 to 6 engineers building specific things, then to keep everybody on the same page, like a product manager which kind of outlines in detail requirements for a specific product and how those requirements are then divided into different teams can be helpful. So I would say at a minimum you need kind of 10 to 15 people building before a product manager is needed. But again, I've seen companies that can go sometimes up to 50 or more people with no product managers and be fine with kind of the engineering managers or the tech leads acting as interim product managers, and that can also be a pretty successful model. But at some point, product managers do help, just making sure that all the things are thought through, all the edge cases are thought through, and then also they can start talking to external customers, spend less time on the product itself, more time also understanding what's the best thing to build.
And for a team, what's the percentage of engineers, designers, and product managers? For example, in your case, you have thousands of engineers, right?
Yeah, and different companies approach it different ways. But for example, I am assigned essentially to 50 to 60 engineers, which I think is a little bit too much. Usually, what I would say is a healthy ratio is 2 to 3 pods. And each pod, I've seen pods work well in the size of like 4 engineers, 4 to 5 engineers. So when we get to like that 15 engineer count to our product manager is usually a pretty good ratio. That being said, you can also have less in the case where you have engineering managers. In some companies, for example, there's an engineering manager for 50 engineers. In that case, you need more product managers. Or in some other companies, you have an engineering manager per pod. So if you have an engineering manager for like 5 or 6, I think that's actually very little. So the engineering manager necessarily steps up to do a lot more of the work, not just coding themselves, but also much more work. So it kind of really depends. In terms of a designer, usually it's pretty good to have a 1-to-1 designer product manager ratio in the product management roles that are customer facing. So designer focus, either UI, UX, but also just user experience and flows. Designers are really, really good to kind of bring clarity and really think through and outline. To some extent, product manager can also be the designer, especially if you're in an early stage where the product manager can kind of all the figmas or the drawings. If instead you kind of start having a product manager with a lot of engineers, so more time has to be spent on the architecture, talking to customers, writing summaries of meetings or going out in conferences or events, then that 1-to-1 ratio product manager to designer really helps, so that the product manager kind of outline a little bit the thought and the designer can really think through the user experience, all the details, and then pass on very detailed diagrams to the engineering for development.
You mentioned that there are a lot of activities involved in day-to-day of like a product manager. What do you think are the most important skills that you probably need to develop and acquire to be a successful product manager?
I think there's some common skills across all types of product management, and then some which are more related to the specific type of product manager you are. So I think 2 fundamental skills to have are very good listening skills. Product manager that steps in a room and starts telling everybody what to do and then leaves is not getting feedback from their team, which is fundamental. So very good listening skills, and depending on the company, very good reading skills, where if there's a lot of documentation, even just internal or external, you need to really sift through a lot of that to understand how competitive products are working, how integrations are working, or even how documents written by other people in the team, like tech specs, are working. And then definitely a good summative writing skill. Product managers definitely have to write docs, but we have to be very clear and short. I've seen very long docs by product managers which could be written in half the time, and you have to think about people reading that doc, whether it's executives or even just engineers who are spending their time trying to understand what you're saying. Then great communication skills. Less is more here. Most of the times, the most effective product managers are very brief. Like they can pass over a point in very short time and very, very concise. They avoid a lot of words. So reading, writing, communication skills. I mean, in general, you need to have a different expertise or generic. So I think you can either be very deep on a subject, really know what you're talking about, or, and that works in some certain companies, for example, like AI, a very good AI product manager will actually know how AI works, all the algorithms, all the trading processes. Or the alternative is you need to be really good at understanding a lot of different things. When I was working in blockchain, right, it really helped that I understood the blockchain technology, but I also understood kind of the financial regulations and how banks and all of that worked. And then I understood also payment methods. All of those together kind of enabled me to be effective across all the spectrum. Even though I wasn't necessarily a deep expert of either of them, I could actually get experts from different fields to talk together and understand each other.
And for people that are listening that in the future are interested in becoming product managers, what do you think are best resources, or what can they do to actually learn and become a product manager?
Yeah, I get asked this question fairly often. If you're in a company right now, I think that the best thing you can do, and it also depends what you're doing right now, right? Because as I mentioned, if you're a project manager, you probably already have a lot of exposure, but then you might get better in understanding more technically how the things are made. If you're a software engineer, you actually might want to try to look outside of purely your product and what you're working on, get more context around why am I doing certain things, how the products work. But in general, getting more context around why a specific company works is always good. If you're a student, maybe you're not working yet, it can be very helpful to understand, again, do hone your technical skills, especially if you want to be in software. It's always good to learn a little bit about software. So what I tell people is like, you should definitely, I think in the modern age, learn Python, right? And a lot of AI experts now say, oh, you won't need to, AI will do that. I disagree. I think if you still, even though AI will do it for you, if you actually know how it works and you've done it yourself, you'll be way more effective at using AIs or whatever to help you LLMs. So that's very important. In general, then, you want to just learn how companies also work and what's the real value proposition. It's often not just product managers, but a lot of companies are distracted by shiny things like nice UIs or hypes. But really, you really need to understand what drives the value of a company. So in that case, kind of studying cores of business, but also analyze it, looking at specific how companies work, which successful companies have worked is pretty helpful. I've noticed that to understand really what's important in a company, usually look at where the CEO comes from. So for example, Amazon now, the CEO came from AWS, right? So it helps you understand how the real value of Amazon is, other than the whole e-commerce, is actually the AWS side of things. And I know sometimes it helps if you look at Boeing. I think it was Boeing, I might be wrong, but the CEO came from the business side. Now that might help why now the company's falling apart, right? And so that really helps you understand what really drives the motivations in a company. It's like, where do the people at the top, where do they actually come from? What have they done before?
And do you have any books or podcasts, some newsletter that you would recommend to?
Yeah, so there's a lot of books specifically about product management, and sometimes they're often very fluffy. I hope this one won't be. I do suggest really looking at actually technical podcasts which explain how products are built. Software Engineering Daily is a really good one, for example. Acquired is a really good podcast to understand the real value behind
macroeconomics
companies.
Also.
I think a very important one, especially lately, especially if you're a founder, is a macroeconomics podcast, because that's going to help you learn about the funding cycle, when you should fund, why funding 5 years ago was a lot easier than now. Understanding the macroeconomic trends is very important. So that's, and more about books in general, learning how to do things. I would say rather than like reading, the books are usually on founders, like the book about Netflix, the book about Uber, all very, very important books, and teach you how decisions are made and what really pushed the company forward versus what took it back.
Yeah. In your case, I was like process when like you were at Stanford and we were looking for like first opportunities as product manager here in Silicon Valley. Like, how did you approach the job search?
Yeah, I think it's what was true at the time is still true today. Meaning, real ultimately is, you need to show your face. I actually found my first job, at a career fair, just talking to people. It wasn't a listed job also, but like by talking to people, giving them a resume, explaining what you want to do. Not necessarily, don't say, oh, I want to be a product manager. Just kind of explain what industry you're interested in, what you want to do. Maybe you want to work in games, or I'm really interested in building physical products, or I'm really interested in creating seamless user experiences. Ultimately, that's what really opens the eyes of people. Like when you want to do something rather than, I want to be a product manager, I don't care where, I just want to be a product manager. That's
just for the title.
Just for the title, yeah. And there's definitely people like that. That usually doesn't work. So talk to people, recruiters, talk to connections. In particular, go to events. That's usually how you actually get, I think, the best leads to get into jobs in general, not just for product manager, but especially as a product manager, it helps that you show up and you kind of are able to explain your point, what you want, and be convincing about what you're looking for.
And in terms of education, would you recommend an MBA? In what cases, in what not? Because that is also a path that it was like considered a possibility for people that want to become like a PM.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, because about, I think, 5 to 10 years ago, you couldn't become a PM at Google if you had an MBA. If you had an MBA, they were just like, no, we were looking for software engineers. They were really looking for that software engineer wanting to be a PM. Fast forward today, I think pretty much all the PMs at Google have an MBA. In general, I think nowadays, with so much opportunity to learn these things elsewhere, you definitely don't need an MBA to become a PM. It helps again with more of the network.
Yeah, for the networking.
It helps, but there's probably other ways and cheaper ways, especially if you don't have an unlimited amount of money to get that network. Just being in San Francisco, you can go to a lot of events. New York is also a very important hub. In Europe, there's some big hubs where there's just this people getting together around work-related themes. Usually, that's the best way. I really don't think you need an MBA. That being said, it's still very good to again get some of that breadth. Usually, to get exposed to a lot of different things you didn't know about, a lot of different industries you didn't know about.
For people that are listening and maybe want to reach out or learn more, where can they find you?
I'm always looking on LinkedIn at Sebastiano Bea, or at Twitter at Seba Bea, or X, I guess.
That's cool. So yeah, thank you very much, and I guess we'll probably see you again in Lyft.
Yeah, best wishes for everyone. Yeah, and get a Lyft.